I'm a climate scientist and science systems engineer at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We know as a world that we're consuming more than one Earth worth of resources every year.
Yeah.
That's not going to be possible forever. At some point, we are going to need to either figure out a way to consume less, reuse more, or we're going to run out of resources.
Speaking of sustainability, a podcast where we talk to frontrunners, innovators, and business specialists on, well, sustainability and where they think their industries are headed, and more importantly, how they can make them more sustainable. Hi there, I'm Hani Larma from Ecochain. In today's conversation, I speak with Dr. Kimberly Miter, a climate scientist at NASA. We talk about her research in climate change and about how businesses can avoid the risks of climate change and harness the opportunities of a sustainable business model. Stay tuned. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our weekly episodes and our guest appearances from experts in the field who share their insider tips on all things sustainable business. So here we are. Well, thank you very much, Kimberly, for being here and joining me in this conversation. I really appreciate you giving us your time and telling us a little bit more about what you do at NASA and about climate science and your work in that regard. So thank you very much for joining us here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, honey.
So if you could first introduce yourself and a little bit your work at NASA and the types of things that you do there in terms of research for climate change.
Sure. So my name is Dr. Kimberly Miter. I'm a climate scientist and science systems engineer at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. So I specifically focus on the Arctic, although I do look at the consequences and risks of climate change all over the world. The Arctic is really rapidly changing, and so that's where we find a lot of our interest lies. And I've been working on that area and arena for a number of years. And with NASA, I've been doing it for about a year and a half, specifically focusing on permafrost changes. And then I've also looked at high alpine regions all over the world that have similar dynamics.
Okay. And what kind of things do you look at in particular in these projects?
So it depends. I like to look at climate risks that are a little bit unknown. So I like to look at things that we assume are going to happen or assume are consequences of climate change and just kind of poke at them and make sure that all our assumptions are correct. So for example, we often assume that glacial meltwater is the purest meltwater on Earth because it's been stored far away from human activities in ice. And what I did during my PhD was do research to find out if it actually was the cleanest meltwater on Earth, which it's not, and then what the consequences of that pollution could be for the people who are interacting with glacial meltwater on a day-to-day basis.
And what did you find in particular? How come it ended up being not what the assumption was?
Sure. So if you think about the Earth as a closed system, everything that we release somewhere on the Earth goes somewhere else. So in this particular case, anything that we release into the atmosphere in terms of chemicals, like pesticides, specifically, we looked at DDT and then PCBs, which is an industrial surfactant. And both of those travel all over the world. And then they get trapped in the cold regions of the North and the South. And in the case of the North, a lot of people live in the North and use water from glaciers or eat fish that live in the streams that are glacial meltwater streams. And so they end up eating some amount of DDT, PCBs, PFAS that was distributed by people far, far away from them.
Wow. And how does that actually get distributed into the environment?
So it'll go from the atmosphere to a glacier, and then it'll be stored in a glacier, right? And if the glaciers were not melting, it would actually be this kind of cleaning mechanism
Yeah.
for all the chemicals that we're releasing. But now that the glaciers are melting, there's the opportunity for these punctuated releases of chemicals to move downstream. And it can be uptaken by the vegetation, by the fish, by the animals, and then it moves its way up through the food chain that way. So anything that eats one of these organisms, then it magnifies in their system and they end up with more chemicals in their system.
Wow. Okay. So it's really more kind of forward-looking information that you're looking into in terms of what could be the consequences for these actions that we are doing today.
Exactly. So I'm trying to find the black swan events, the unknown unknowns, before they even happen.
So, if you could just describe a little bit, what does sustainability mean for you at your work?
So I think sustainability is a hard word because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different
Yeah.
people. Um, I think for me personally, sustainability just describes a state of being that we can just maintain for a long time. So that can start in the person level, how are you able to do your day to day for a long time?
Yeah.
It could be, your home, your garden. How do you maintain your garden for a long time? And then it goes out from there in concentric circles. How does the larger town that you're a part of maintain? The larger city, the country, and then these systems of consumerism that we all rely on. So, how do we get our food? And how do we maintain this level of functioning for the future without harming all the ecosystems that we're dependent on? So it's kind of a complicated word, even though it's maybe really short and it seems concise. It's got a lot to it.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, sustainability is quite a complicated term, and it can be used in different ways. But what would you say are the kind of global consequences of not taking in um, sustainability and the environmental perspective into consideration on a societal level?
Well, we know as a world that we're consuming more than one Earth worth of resources every year.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's actually quite a large number of Earth's worth of resources.
Wow.
And that's not going to be possible forever. At some point, we are going to need to either figure out a way to consume less, reuse more, or we're going to run out of resources.
Yeah.
So I think that there are really serious consequences of not having the ability to maintain indefinitely what we're doing, which for me is the heart of the word sustainability. Like I said, this ability to maintain.
Yeah. And how critical is the situation? Is this something that's really relevant for today, or is this something that we could wait a few years on? How critical is the situation in terms of needing to really take action?
Well, to be fully honest with you, it's been critical my entire life. Back when I was born, it was already a critical conversation.
Yeah.
So we're getting to the point that it's going to be very difficult to go back to the stable system, where we have regular seasons and not too many extreme events, and we can predict um, the weather long range and the climate is stable. It's going to be difficult in the not so distant future to get back to that stability. And I think that's going to be a very hard time and it would not be ideal. It would be much, much better if we were able to figure out a way to live in the ecosystem that in a way that's maybe more, like you're saying, sustainable, but has this ongoing connectivity that we can rely on so the ecosystem is not harmed by us and we're not harmed by it.
Yeah. And do you think that that's something that's possible to achieve?
I think this is a hard time in human history because we are right at the precipice of amazing technological and social gains that are going to allow us to have a different style of living and a different relationship to the planet. But I think right now we are still in the place where we're figuring it out. And it's going to be a very difficult transition to make for all of us to get used to a new way of living, a new way of thinking about the planet. And it could be really positive. I think that if we were to walk down the street and see more trees, more vertical gardens on buildings, and just have, a more holistic natural experience, I think we'd really enjoy it. But it's going to be a lot of work to get there.
And speaking of work, how could we break this down for businesses? How could they contribute to this type of sustainability, the kind of longevity that we're speaking about? Yeah. And how could we communicate this to them? What can they do?
So sustainability, like I said, has a bunch of concentric circles in it. So if businesses were to start in the very center and think about what can they do on their properties, right? If they own the building, they could set up vertical gardens. They could set up a green roof. They could plant trees around, and then they can create a better indoor environment for their employees as well. Introduce air filters, introduce plants, and that all improves morale and improves productivity. And then if you go in the concentric circles out, they can improve the way that their product chains work. Who's responsible for recycling or reusing their products, making sure that they have a life cycle analysis going on. So I think that there's ways to improve sustainability for every company, starting very, very small and very local, and then gradually expanding out with a multi-year plan. And I think it's actually quite doable. It just requires, one person or a group of people to really spearhead it and track it and make sure that it's on progress and moving forward, just like any other initiative that a company employs.
Right. So, how I understand this is that businesses should look at their kind of inward activities and their outward activities and see what are they actually providing sort of internally for the company, but also the products and services that they're providing outwards. And what kind of impact does that have on society and the environment?
Sure. I think of it a little bit more like place. So the place that they are in physically, the place that their products come from physically,
Yeah.
the place their products go physically.
Yeah.
But I think that your example is absolutely excellent. An inward and outward looking focus is also a very strong way to approach it.
Great. Um, and what risks do you think there are for businesses who don't start with this type of sustainability really now in the short term as soon as possible?
Well, I think there are a number of risks. There's always the risk that a business could be left behind by a changing market and by changing demand signals.
Mhm.
I think that's always a concern in any field for any business.
Yeah.
I do also think that there's a level of protection that some of these steps provide. So, if a business, for example, looks at their supply chain and understands the way that both climate change and severe weather could disrupt or impact their supply chain now, that in the future, they'll be ready to enact any kind of emergency measures that need to happen so that they don't have to stop production, that they can move forward and continue to have whatever products or services they provide. So I think there's a couple different risks.
Yeah.
Maybe social and physical is the way to think about it.
Yeah.
But they are very real, and a lot
Yeah.
of companies are definitely realizing the situation actively.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point you raised. It might not be something that is threatening their supply chain today, currently, or their products. But if they're not looking into it now, it could be too late.
Yeah, and that's really true. That's the way that most businesses, I think, do development. They're always aware if you're going to go to a country that has civil war potential, for example,
Mhm.
you need to be prepared for that outcome. So this is exactly the same thing. It's just more of a physical threat than a social threat.
So kind of risks and opportunities in terms of analyzing where their business is going.
And I do think that it is an opportunity to capture a market that is very eager for
Yeah.
sustainability and for, new thinking, creative thinking,
Yeah.
and almost like a collectiveness that we're all working together towards a certain goal. You really see that along the millennial and the Gen Z lines.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of companies are looking into CO2 emissions, so carbon emissions, which is great, obviously. But what are the other impact categories that you think are important for companies to be aware of and measure?
I would say the number one is pollution. And so that takes a number of different avenues. Like you said, carbon, which is a form of pollution when we just
Yeah.
dump it in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Plastic pollution is something that I'm very interested in. And I think a lot of people are starting to pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah.
And then any other kind of effluent, any other kind of chemical that is produced, or any other kind of byproduct that is produced by a company. Um, I think all of those things are really important to capture and get a hold on now before regulation starts to come into effect, because I do believe that we will see more and more regulation in the way that companies interact with their local and international environment.
Yeah.
So again, managing it now gives you that market edge. It gives you a whole new demographic potentially. And it also means that you don't have to deal with regulation in the future because you're already self-regulating in the present.
Right. And I know that you've done a really interesting study on the effects of climbing gear on Mount Everest. I find that really interesting. Could you please tell a little bit about the results that you found? What were the effects of climbing gear on a place like Mount Everest?
Of course, yeah. So we had two studies at the top of Mount Everest right before the summit where we took snow samples and identified both microplastics and PFAS, which is
Mhm.
Teflon. So
Right.
the stuff that keeps the gear from getting wet, and the stuff that the gear is made of is
Mhm.
shedding all over the mountain. So we had incredibly high levels
Wow.
of both of those, extraordinarily high to the point where we went back and checked our measurements multiple times to make sure we weren't messing up because it was way higher than we were expecting.
Right.
And, that information was carried by the Washington Post and GQ. And I know that they spoke with Patagonia and the North Face and a number of other companies trying to understand, do those companies know what's happening? Are they tracking the
Right.
disintegration of
Like
their
what's going
gear in
on?
wild spaces? Yeah. And, I think that some companies are more or less aware of this. Right now, the challenge is that there are not too many other alternatives unless we're going to go back to, wool, which is a great option for regular outdoor activities. Maybe not such a great option for the top of Mount Everest.
Yeah. I think it really does illustrate also the importance for companies really having a grip on the possible effects that their products might have on the environment and the surroundings and potentially even people. So that's really, really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think Mount Everest is another one that we just all assume is this faraway place that very few people go to. And
Right.
it's a very special place. But as you saw from the photos of the year that we did this study, there are very many people that climb Mount Everest these days. And
Right.
all of them bring a lot of gear for their own survival, which is necessary. And it ends up tracking up and down the mountain. And that's, really true of any of these climbs that are heavily populated or any of the other remote places where we have a lot of tourism.
Yeah, right. And I guess that also speaks for the type of clothing and gear in general that we're bringing into the environment and the effects it could have.
Yeah, and part of the point that GQ made in their article was, maybe it's not a great idea to wear outdoor gear just for fun.
Right.
Maybe outdoor gear should be reserved for really serious outdoor activities, and for just for fun, we should be wearing more of the natural materials.
Yeah, and kind of thinking about the purpose that the product is really built for.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great way to say it. And making sure that, even though it's maybe trendy to wear certain things in certain
Mhm.
environments, we don't want to create more of a problem, and not really be aware of the footprint we're leaving on the individual level.
Yeah, that's right. So we kind of touched upon the why. Why is it important to have a grip on these possible side effects of the products that we are producing and using? But now I'd also like to touch upon, well, I think there's a kind of phenomena within science communication where scientific facts are widely accepted by governments and businesses. But why doesn't there seem to be this urgency that we're all looking for? What do you think went wrong with science communication, or did something go wrong?
And I'm not sure. I know that we like to blame science communication, even in the scientific community, we do that. I'm not sure that that's actually what happened because,
Okay.
if you think about how our brains work, sometimes it's very hard to think outside of our own city and our own region,
Yep.
much less the entire world. It becomes very existential and almost esoteric when
Mhm.
we talk about something that's happening for the whole world or happening in
Right.
ecosystems in
Right.
countries we've never been to. So I think that that's part of the problem is it's
Mhm.
the same as when you think about astrophysics and you're trying to think about the whole universe and the fact that it's expanding and your brain at some point just kind of quits and just
Yeah.
never mind. And I think it's actually kind of similar. The earth is huge and we're just all so little.
Mhm.
And it's only like from an airplane that you really get the scale, or from
Yeah.
satellites, you can really understand the scale. And so I do think that though maybe science communication can always improve and, has improved over the
Yeah.
last few decades. I also think that the scale of the problem is really hard to deal with. It's really hard to wrap your head around, and especially as an individual. It's you against the entire planet changing. How are you supposed to do something? And
Mhm.
that's why I think it's really important to do small activities, and
Okay.
just to make sure that there are things in your day to day life that you are contributing.
Right.
And whether it's planting some native flowers or creating a food and water space for birds or, writing to elected representatives.
Right.
There's a lot of ways to interact, but it's a hard thing to do. It's a big, big problem.
Right. Right. So we have to have some empathy for people not necessarily understanding the bigger picture, and really trying to work on the little steps that we can do every day.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's a privilege to see and
Right.
understand the bigger picture. In order to be able to have the time to do so, basic needs must be considered. People
Yeah.
have to have somewhere to live and food and sustainability in their own life and sleep and all of these things before they're able to think about these huge esoteric problems.
Yeah.
So, those are also real struggles, and it can sometimes eclipse the other issues that we need to think and talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So we also have to not forget the social aspect of sustainability.
100%.
So we've talked about the kind of potential downfalls of climate science, but what within climate science gives you hope currently?
Well, I think that the fact that there are so many people that are now discussing this, that are working towards these goals,
Yeah.
not just in climate science, but in all the interlocking science fields and other sector domains. As you mentioned in business, this is a big conversation. This is a big conversation in politics. This is a
Yep.
big conversation in social science and physical science. And I think that there's lots of people who are talking about this, who are focused on this, who are interested in it. I know that the interest in my work has just gone absolutely through the roof in the last few
Right.
years. And that's been very hopeful for me because I felt like some of the things we were talking about were really critical, but
Mm.
not that many people were listening. And
Yeah.
it feels like a lot of people are listening now.
That's
And
great.
that is fantastic. So I think we need to take the next step from listening and caring to acting. And like I said, that could even just be in people's day to day lives in the way that they interact with their personal environment or their regional and local environment.
That's great. And so, kind of on that topic, what other people, organizations, or companies inspire you by what they are doing to make our society and our economy more sustainable?
So I think personally, I have a handful of favorites. The ocean cleanup, which I believe is actually based out of the Netherlands, is
Yeah, I
one of
know.
my absolute
Great
favorites.
organization.
That's what Boy and Slants, I think.
Yeah.
Um, Absolutely stunning. They're doing incredible work. And there's a number of other ocean cleanup groups that are doing really good work, but I think they're the pioneers.
Great.
I'm also very inspired by the rangers, I guess, bush rangers in
Okay.
Africa who are putting their bodies on the line to protect animals from poachers.
Well,
And I think that's absolutely extraordinary. There's a lot of really, really amazing women who are part of that group. And they are tougher and more resilient and more determined than I will ever understand. And they inspire me every single day.
wow.
Aside from that, there's a lot of Generation Z people who are coming up and are ready to bring this conversation to the spotlight already. Even though they're students, even though they're meant to be learning their maths, they're
Yeah.
they're also focusing on this physical science component, which it took many, many years for many of us to get a hold on. They're already working really hard to understand it, and that inspires me all the time.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, thank you very much for sharing this. And thank you for all the knowledge and great examples and everything that you shared with us today. It's been really, really interesting. We're already at the end of our interview. So thank you so much for your time. And I would love to speak with you sometime soon again.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.